Imagine enrolling your child with special needs into a specialized education sector, trusting that they will be kept safe with a close supervision, but only later to be informed that your child was injured, with no clear explanation of how it happened. This is exactly the situation faced by the appellants in this case. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and hi everyone. So for today, I will be introducing to you guys a case that falls under tort law, specifically tort of negligence. The case examines a crucial question in tort law, which is what level of care does the law expect from institutions that care for vulnerable children? The case is Al-Hassan Al-Qassar, Bani Al-Marsh and another,
and
Kids for Kids SDA PhD 2025 MLGU 3365. The case was heard in the High Court of Kuala Lumpur, with the judgment delivered by an Arif Rose Marwa Rosen J. The appellants are a special child with his father, and the respondent is Kids for Kids Group SDN PhD, which is a company operating a specialized education center. Now let's move on to the matter of facts so that you guys can understand deeper about this case. The first appellant is a 13 years old Syrian boy diagnosed with multiple conditions including Cohen syndrome, Cliff-Star syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Due to these conditions, the child needs close supervision and specialized care. The respondent operates a specialized education center and offers a program known as CARE program. This program was advertised as providing individualized education plan, close supervision, and a safe learning environment for children with special needs. Relying on this advertisement, the father enrolled his child into this program and paid deposit for 5,400 and fee program 2,800. On 8 November 2021, while the child was under the respondent's supervision, the child sustained injuries including a bruise to his forehead. However, although the special education center already informed the child's father, they could not explain what actually happened and how the injury occurred. Few weeks after the incident, the father observed a deterioration in the child's behavior and psychological well-being. Concerned about his child's safety, he withdrew his child from the program. However, despite the circumstances, the respondent refused to refund the deposit and fees and claimed that the withdrawal was made without sufficient notice. This matter was first heard in the Sessions Court, but the court dismissed this claim. Dissatisfied with this situation, the appellant appealed to the High Court and giving rise to the present case. Based on these facts, this case raises several key legal issues under the tort of law. The first issue is whether the respondent owed the child a duty of care given that the respondent was a center catering for children with special needs. The second legal issue is whether the respondent breached that duty of care by failing to give adequate supervision to the kid. The third issue is whether the respondent's breach caused the child physical injury and the deterioration of his psychological well-being, thereby establishing liability in negligence. However, there was also a related contractual issue, namely whether the respondent was entitled to forfeit the deposit following the withdrawal of the child from the program.
now that we've examined the material facts and the legal issue raised in this case, I will move on to the argument brought by both parties, followed by the legal principle applied by the High Court in reaching its decision. The appellate argument were firmly grounded in tort of negligence, focusing on the existence of duty of care, breach of duty, and the causal link between the breach and the harm suffered. So firstly, the appellant argued that Kids for Kids owe the child duty of care arising from the special relationship between a specialized education center and a vulnerable child with multiple disabilities. Given the child medical condition and developmental age, the appellant contended that this duty required a heightened standard of supervision. Secondly, on the issue of breach, the appellant emphasized that the injury occurred while the child was attending the CARE program within the respondent premises and during the program hours with the material time. So the child was under the exclusive care and the control for the respondent. Despite this, the respondent was unable to provide a clear, satisfactory explanation to how the injury occurred. The appellant submitted that this failure to supervise adequately and to account for the injury amounted to breach of duty, particularly in the light of the child's known vulnerabilities. Thirdly, on the causation, the appellant argued that the respondent breach directly resulted in the child's physical injury and subsequently contribute to the deterioration in his psychological well-being. So the deterioration ultimately led to the father's decision to withdraw the child from the program. In response, the respondent denied liability in negligence. While respondent accepted that duty of care existed, they argued that there was no breach of duty because reasonable supervision had been provided throughout the program. The respondent further contended that the injury was not reasonably foreseeable and suggested that the child may have caused the injury himself due to his medical and behavioral conditions. In relation to the contractual aspect, the respondent argued that the withdrawal from the program was a voluntary decision by the father and that under the terms of care program, the forfeiture of the deposit was therefore justified. With this competent argument in mind, I will now turn to the legal principle applied by the High Court in resolving the disputes. The High Court applied fundamental principles of negligence with a particular emphasis on the protection of vulnerable persons. The ratio decidendi of this case is that a specialized education center owes a heightened and non-delegable duty of care to children with special needs, and where a child is injured while under the exclusive supervision of the center, the failure to explain how the injury occurred may itself constitute a breach of duty. So in this case, the injury occurred within the respondent premises during the program hours and while the child was under the respondent's supervision and control. The respondent's inability to provide satisfactory explanation was therefore a critical factor in establishing the breach. In determining the standard of care owed, the court referred to the government of Malaysia and others and Jumat bin Mahmud. In this case, a student was injured during a school activity and the court held that the teachers basically owe a duty of care similar to that of a careful parent. However, the High Court emphasized that this parental standard is not rigid and must be adapted to the circumstances, which in this present case, the child suffered from Cohen syndrome, Cliff-Strauss syndrome and PTSD and ADHD and had a developmental age of only 3 to 4 years. These facts justify the imposition of a higher standard of supervision than that owed to the ordinary student. The court further relied on Woodland and Essex County Council, where a student nearly drowned during a swimming lesson conducted by an external contractor. The UK Supreme Court held that schools owe a non-delegable duty of care to ensure the reasonable care is taken for pupils, particularly where the pupils are vulnerable and under the school's control. So, applying this principle to present case, the High Court held that the respondent could not escape liability by pointing to individual staff members, as the duty to ensure a reasonable care rested with the institution itself. So this approach consistent with the Malaysian Federal Court decision in Hamrach & Co. and Tenaga Nasional Berhad (TNB), where the court recognized that non-delegable duties may arise in relationship involving vulnerability, reliance, and assumption of responsibility. In assessing whether there was a breach of duty, the court also referred to Winfield and Jolowicz on Tort, which stated that where a defendant knows or ought to know of a claimant disability, that disability must be taken into account when evaluating the gravity of the risk and the precaution required. In this case, the respondent was fully aware of the child's medical condition upon the enrollment into the care program, thereby increasing the level of the care expected under the law. On the issue of causation, the court found that the injury occurred while the child was under the respondent's supervision and within its premise established a sufficient causal link between the breach of duty and the harm suffered. So, the court applied the doctrine of res ipsa loquitur, meaning the thing speaks for itself. Given that the injury was of a kind that would not ordinarily occur without negligence, and that the respondent was in the best position to explain how it happened, but failed to do so. An inference of negligence was justified. In addressing foreseeability, the court applied the test in Overseas Township and Morse Dock, commonly known as the wagon mount, where the Privy Council held that the damage must be reasonably foreseeable, though not necessarily probable. In the present case, the High Court held that the risk of injury was reasonably foreseeable given the child's behavioral tendency and the need for a close supervision in the specialized care environment. As arbiter dicta, the judge highlighted the absence of safeguards such as CCTV monitoring, detailed individual education plans, and proper incident documentation, while not determinative on their own. So these safeguards were relevant in assessing whether reasonable care had been taken. Having explained the argument and the legal principle applied by the court, I will now pass the discussion to Myra, who will outline the court's judgment and provide a critical analysis of the decision.
So we have talked about the fact of this case, about the issue of this case, about the argument, and also legal principles that can be applied. So how about the judgment of this case? What kind of comment and analysis that can be given towards this case? So right now, I will conclude with you guys by discussing on how the High Court give the judgment towards this case, followed by my comments and analysis on the decision. So in this case, the High Court allowed the appeal and overturned the decision of the Session Court. The court held that Kids for Kids Group Sendirian Berhad was negligent and had breached its duty of care owed to the child. So while the Session Court accepted that the duty of care existed, it concluded that there was no breach and no causation. Why? Because they say that they found this to be plainly wrong. The court emphasized that the injury occurred while the child was under the respondent care on its premises and during operating hours. So crucially, the respondent was unable to explain on how the injury actually happened there. The court held that for a vulnerable child with special needs, the failure to account for an injury while under supervision itself amounted to inadequate supervision and therefore a breach of duty. As a result, negligence was established on a balance of probabilities and the respondent was held liable. The High Court decision is legally correct. It reflects a careful and principled application of negligence law. The court rightly recognized that institutions caring for children with special needs own a heightened and non-negligible duty of care. So this duty cannot be avoided by shifting blame to individual staff members or by claiming uncertainty over how the injury occurred. Importantly, the court adopted a realistic approach by acknowledging the vulnerable children may not be able to clearly explain what happened to them. In such cases, it would be unjust to require the claimant to prove the exact mechanism of injury. The application here, the doctrine of res ipsa loquitur, was therefore appropriate, since the injury occurred under the respondent exclusive control and no satisfactory explanation was given, and interference of negligence could properly be drawn. Court's reasoning here also reinforces that forcibility does not require certainty. Given the child's known the disabilities and need for close supervision, the risk was reasonably foreseeable and should have been guarded against. Overall, this judgment strengthened the protection afforded to vulnerable children and sent a clear message that institutions which market themselves as specialized care provider must be held accountable to the standard they promise. So, to conclude all of this discussion, this case demonstrates that the law of negligence places a heavy responsibility on institutions entrusted with the care of vulnerable individuals. Where a child is injured under the supervision and no clear explanation can be provided, the law will not allow accountability to be avoided. So the High Court decision here therefore not only resolve this dispute but also reinforce the broader principle that the safety and welfare of vulnerable children must always come first. That's all for our discussion today. We'll end our discussion here. Thank you.